I'm clearly visible and audible.
Yes, you are.
Cool. I am sick. If I have a coughing fit in my speech, do forgive me. I'll begin my speech in three, two, one. 2 points in my speech. First, on crisis, why the US is a more stable place to hold foreign reserves in. Second, on why geopolitical dependence on the US is good and why we get more of it. Amitai will have a point in his speech about trade. I just want to flag one thing in rebuttal. The motion doesn't change reliance on American banks, just the use of US dollars as foreign reserves. It doesn't go through American banks, it goes through the central bank. So I'm not sure what changes on that regard. Let's get into crisis. I want to start by explaining why external shocks affect other countries much more than they affect the US. And I have multiple reasons here. First, it's about the diversification and strength of the economy on its own. Why is this important? Most countries are reliant on a few strong local industries. They might specialize in low-level manufacturing or agriculture or specific natural resource mining. They also tend to have few trade partners they rely on for import or export, especially in the 20th century. All this means that shocks to specific industries or fields can lead to collapse of a country's economy, and collapse of specific import or export partners can lead to a trickle-down contagion effect of how crises spread. Why is the US a better option? The US has the most diverse economy. They have large-scale manufacturing, think the Iron Belt. They have service industries like nowhere else in the world and had the tech boom. They have natural resources, being a large and geologically active country, meaning that almost any natural resource can be found in the US, and they're the number one agriculture exporter and creator in the world. The second reason is that the US has the easiest trade routes, both internally and externally. The Mississippi River system is connected via a canal to the Great Lakes and to the East Coast through both Louisiana and St. Lawrence, which means that 2/3 of the American population and 80% of their industry has water access, which makes for far easier and cheaper trades and moving of goods than because the goods float on water and you don't have to spend the immense costs of transport via air or rail or truck. They also have coasts on both oceans, along with access to the Bering Strait and control the Panama Canal. All this means they have very easy access to alternative import-export streams, and being such a large and diverse country, already have import-export relationships with almost every country in the world, which means they're least likely to be affected by contagion and are most likely to be able to maintain internal industry. Finally, they have the richest consumers and corporations in the world, which means that they get far more economic stimulation, especially when these investors seek to make the most of the crisis by being the first to invest as the crisis comes to an end, which speeds up the rate at which it comes to an end. The impact of all this is that the US is far less likely to collapse or even be influenced by any given crisis. They're far less affected by contagion and are far more diversified, making them far more stable. Even though this mech is already enough, I want to give a few more mechs for stability. First, they have the most competent and capable central bank. They can aggregate data from the whole world using the best cutting edge tools and computers, as well as the smartest, best trained experts, since the best business and investment schools are in the US, along with having the most power. Because the US is the largest economy, then they simply have the most money they're able to spend. All of this means that they're best able to plan how to exit both local and global crises. Add on to this the fact that the US is fiscally conservative, so they have a lot of money to spare. Because compared to most rich countries, they typically charge low taxes and offer little welfare, they have the easiest potential to raise taxes in or after a crisis. That means that the wiggle room helps them overcome issues like COVID or the 2008 crisis via either bailouts or helicopter investments. All of this means that the government and central bank are both uniquely capable to step in times of crisis. Finally, US bonds are in high demand because corporations want to buy from the hegemon. They're uniquely valued over that of any other country. This creates a feedback loop of stability. Because I know that because the US can sell bonds in crisis, because everyone trusts that in 20 years the US economy will be doing well. The US can similarly borrow most easily because people have the greatest trust in the US ability to repay this. All of this means the US has the greatest capacity to both stabilize their own economy, stabilize their own currency, and actively reinvest in other economies. This already is enough to show how much more stability we get. Why is stability of currency essential in crisis? These first, it gives us re-stimulation money. As a third party, you need to have the money to prop up businesses and prevent them from failing, to reinvest money to reinvigorate the economy, and to give people the rent or food checks that they need in order to survive the crisis in the immediate term. All of that you can do exclusively if you have a stable reserve currency. But beyond that, you also get to afford importation of crucial goods and prevent collapse or starvation. If you need to afford food right now because you're Egypt and your own currency collapsed, US dollar is your best bet. If you need to afford precursor raw materials for the stuff that you manufacture and you need to buy now in order to make sure that your manufacturing doesn't grind to a halt and closes down, you are most able to do that with US currency. I challenge any team in this debate to weigh any metric above stability or prove that anything is more stable than the US. Let's take a POI from closing.
Where do you think the vast majority of dollars are held around the world, and to what extent do you think the US's position as a prominent hegemon in the world actually influences the value of the US dollar?
I think that even if we don't influence everything I already explained influences the value of the US dollar, even if you don't buy hegemony in particular, which means that any country, I don't care where those dollars are held, benefits from this stability. Let's talk about dependence on the US. Why does holding US dollar create dependency on the US? First, you have a joint interest to keep the dollar stable. So, for instance, you want to sell oil to the US. Venezuela and pre-revolution Iran, despite not being heavily allied with the US during the oil crisis in the 70s caused by the Arab embargo, stepped in order to prevent a crisis that would harm them and their US dollar reserves. It even goes so far as, in times of peace, to desire to increase the value of the US currency, period, because I'm invested in it heavily, which means that all of my investments benefit if I do trade with American companies. It means that I want to accept American investors into my corporations. It means that I want to sell my good to America because I then benefit from that as well. But beyond that, because the American central bank decides the value of the currency, I want to make good with them so that when there's a crisis, they respect my needs. Now, the US does take individual allies into account, but they also take in the needs of entire regions, and my needs are likely similar to those of my neighbors, i.e. in an agricultural or in a manufacturing region of the world. Why is it good that they're dependent on the US geopolitically? First, because the US pushes these countries to enact more human rights, more environmental regulations, and more cooperation with international regulations on things like sanctions, tariffs, and trades, and cooperation with the World Trade Organization and IMF and the rest of the international fiscal order. But secondly, because they cooperate with the US peace-led order and the current hegemony that prevents war. For all of these reasons, opening opposition.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a very fine speech, and I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to come and continue their case, or Deputy Prime Minister to come and continue their case. You are still muted.
Sorry about that. Am I good now?
Yes, you are.
Awesome. Just some pleasantries again. Thank you all for this debate. Thanks to the tournament. Oh. The problem with LO is that it's a laundry list of reasons as to why the US is just really, really good and controlling their economic growth is really, really good. If we prove to you that this isn't the case, or sorry, we're going to win that they're by their own metric, this isn't going to be the case. But note all of the conceded material from Hushman's speech that got absolutely zero engagement. The first claim we hear from LO is that the US just has more economic strength. They have strong levels of local industries that are highly diverse, and they have things like the Mississippi River that allow for good things like trade. The important thing here is that even under the SDR model, right? It's not like we're all dependent on one country. All of the countries in the SDR basket presumably also are highly developed countries or emerging market economies that have high degrees of specialization and diversification across all of them together. So it's unclear as to why a single price shock in one specific industry is suddenly going to hit us worse than it hits them. The delta here is that on our side, you get a far greater balance. That is to say, you're far less likely to see some level of crisis that affects the US affect every single other country, which note is incredibly likely. The second response here is that the US just is unstable, right? Note that even if the US has metrics and mechanisms like the Mississippi River or like central banks that are able to stabilize itself, this doesn't necessarily mean that every single other country just isn't harmed, right? A few reasons as to why the US is unstable. One is on a level of empirics, this just is the case, right? For example, the fact of highly deregulated financial markets in 2007 causing a subprime mortgage crisis that spiraled out of control means that there's a high chance of crisis here. But second, the prevalence of large hedge funds in the US that largely bet on things like speculative finance means that there's also a high degree of instability because these things are inherently incredibly uncertain. But secondly, the stabilizing process for the US to stabilize its economy is also incredibly damaging. In 2013, when the US began to engage in quantitative tightening or tightening after the financial crisis in 2008, what happened was it massively increased its interest rates, and countries like India saw massive outflows of foreign investment. That's incredibly important because on our side, our side will agree that the US probably does control the global economy to a significant degree. If that is the case, then that means that the effects of the US or fiscal and monetary decisions of the US on our side are far less likely to spill over to other countries in which they actually have incredibly negative results. But three is the POI from CG. Yes, many US dollars are held in foreign central banks. The reason that's incredibly bad is because it leads to things like the ability for central banks and other private equity firms and businesses in other countries to highly speculate on the value of the US dollar. So it's incredibly unclear as to why the value of this one currency is so much better. The delta here is, again, that countries are more able to stabilize their own currencies because the whims of their currencies are less, the whims of the basket as a whole is less likely to be subject to like changes within one country, which is the US on their side. The next thing to say here that I want to respond to is that the US is fiscally conservative, which means that they have extra reserves, which means that they're able to solve the crisis better. Like, this just isn't true, right? Like, the US is one of the very few countries in the world whose central bank specifically has a dual mandate of both protecting against inflation and raising unemployment. Central banks in other countries like France and Germany specifically focus on reducing inflation, which is why these countries tend to hold massive amounts of budget surpluses rather than the $1 trillion US deficit that constantly hikes up interest rates, which causes other countries to have massive amounts of debt crisis because they're not able to pay continuing interest on their debt, which is pegged against the dollar. That's incredibly important because even on their own metric, I think these other countries are just far better insofar as you include Germany and other European countries into the basket. The last argument that Elo says that I want to respond to is this argument about like human rights and the US ability to pressure countries on this. The first thing to note is that we would say that justice in as many cases that the US like does good things for human rights, it probably also does bad things, right? I.e., us using our dominant dollar power to sanction other countries and literally prevent other people in these countries from buying food is probably very bad, even if the US is able to exert some level of economic pressure against other countries. But secondly, I think this is largely symmetric on either side. The reason why is because the countries in the basket, most of them are also Western liberal democracies that hold the same values as the US does, which means that as like human rights is not going to be a ballot in this debate. But third, you can flip the argument. The argument that Usher provided at the bottom about China entirely flips this. The reason as to why is because when countries are forced to track their currency to the dollar, and the dollar is reserve currency, what happens is they're unlikely to take debt from dollarized sources because they are afraid of the dollar's volatility and afraid that they're not able to pay it back because of like a very strong dollar. That's what causes them to take debt from other sources like China, which are incredibly worse for human rights because these countries just tend to have far less protections on human rights and care more about just gaining large amounts of geopolitical influence here. I just want to weigh this really quickly. One, it's not just about human rights, right? The fact that countries like China are largely authoritarian and do not care about long-term stability and more so just get a short-term return on their investment means that you're more likely to get things like the seizing of assets through the Belt and Road Initiative. You're more likely to get massive like debt spirals later on in the future when maybe you construct one project, but every single other project or every single other thing that would loan is incredibly bad. At that point, we think that the result and the counterfactual is just far worse because far worse. The reason why we're able to make it better is the presence of a better option that is not the dollar encourages Chinese lenders to have far better rates and far less extortionary conditions at the point in which now they have to compete with these other they'll compete with the basket as well as the dollar, which means that we just get better conditions for foreign investment and better trade deals later on. The next thing I want to talk about is to actually weigh why stability in other countries and developing countries' ability to control their currency is the most important clash in the round and weighing over everything CG says. The mechanism as to how we get there is that having a basket means that fluctuations in one area are able to cancel out in other areas, which means that when the US raises interest rates or lowers interest rates, that's canceled out by other places. The reason why this is incredibly Okay, it's protected time. Sorry about that. Okay, the reason why stability is going to outweigh the reason why this is incredibly important is because what Ashwin said is that there's massive markets and derivatives in the status quo, which causes large amounts of fluctuation in the financial market. There's three impacts of this. First, because it controls the ability for investments for like groups to buy the currency in the first place. You're never going to buy a currency that is highly volatile, which means that these countries are never going to be able to raise the value of their currency later. But secondly, the same is true for investment, i.e. you would not do FDI in a country if you think that the exchange rates are going to be changing constantly, which our side is able to solve. But third, on a level of exports, it's far harder to cooperate with companies in other countries and create contracts with them that allow you to sell your goods to different markets if the international exchange rates is just incredibly confusing and likely to fluctuate. But fourth, on a level of country policy, it means that your ability to tax and spend is forestalled when you literally do not know how valuable your currency is relative to other currencies when you're doing things like financing your debt. All of this means that maybe you get some level of investment and some level of trade on opposition side, but all of that trade is likely to be incredibly volatile and go away, and the chilling effect that creates means that on net, it's incredibly small. For all of these reasons, Bodo.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a very fine speech and remind all speakers to both take and offer POIs, and I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to come and continue their case.
Can you clearly hear me?
Yep, you're all good.
3, 2, 1. Ashwin starts their speech by referring to the 70s economic crisis in Asia. This is a very funny example for Gov, because you know what happened in the 70s? What happened is that Russian bonds started to collect interest rates that were so high because the Russian economy had to recover given crises. This meant that Southeast Asian countries that were wholly dependent on Russian bonds started to experience a massive crisis due to the massive speculation in Russian bonds, which led to economic collapses in Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea. This was only resolved by the use of dollars in foreign reserves of these countries, and by the US giving more money to be used as foreign reserves by these countries a few years later. On their side, the crisis would have exacerbated for 20 years. That is our case. Before I handle the main crisis the main clash of crisis, the first thing I want to do is flip government on the questions of trade and investment. Their claim here is that there is that interest on debt by countries is going to increase significantly, which means paying back loans is hard. This is such a fucking debate-led argument. Like, do you know how few loans are pegged to the interest rate in a way that there's a term for it in English, ESL moment, whatever. Like that interest rates affect the debt that you owe. The overwhelming majority are in absolute debt that isn't reliant on the currency. For the simple reason, the countries know they want to fortify against this risk, which is why when they take loans, this usually exists in clauses. Second response is that even if it's true, it's just not catastrophic because some underlying premise in the OG case is that strangely, if you have foreign currency reserves in dollars, your entire fucking economy is in dollars. Like what? Foreign reserves are there for use in cases of emergency and in cases when you need to trade internationally. But obviously, you can still turn through commission your own currency into whatever currency that you want and trade with it. Sure, commission is a little expensive, but if you want to engage with other countries and export, you just fucking convert your own currency and commission isn't that bad, especially if commission on your currency like decreases because the US dollar is now a less safe currency, so others want to trade with your currency with you. The third and really important response is, given my previous responses, you should probably understand that the extent to which debt is affected is small. But that small change is actually really, really good. It decreases the wish by populous countries like India or like East Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union to massively spend because they know that interest collects and because the central banks bar them from doing so for fear that debt will collect. If anything, this is an impact for our side. Some positive things I want to say in terms of why trade and investment becomes better in our side. First, I want to once again flip as positive OO material their claim about exports. Once again, exports through economies that are mainly reliant on low currencies will be used through your currency. That is why you use a very low valued currency in order to sell well, and it doesn't matter if on their side it is valued slightly less because it's still European currencies, which means it's still uncompetitive for exports. We would rather have a currency that is most highly valued rather than one that is in the middle, because that means we can use this currency in times where even export-oriented economy needs to import. And notice that they do, because often they're specialized economies. They export oil, but they need grain. And so using these for imports is far, far better and assures that we have some of both. We can use our currency for exports and the other and dollars for imports. Lastly, no, I'll just skip that and do it at the end if I have time. Next fund clash on crisis. We love crisis. What does OG say on crisis? OG gives a lot of reasons for why the US market is financially speculative. I have no idea how they didn't notice that literally the reason for why speculation happens in the US is because companies have invested in safe enough assets that they then make the rational decision to start investing in more risky assets because they know they won't collapse as a result. They have a cause, like a solution, whatever, mismatch something. We think that that means that you invest in only in risky assets because you know you're safe, which isn't a guarantee that exists in developing countries, which is why there aren't high-risk investments in these countries. But moreover, if they want to talk about the safety of assets, note that there are many more safe companies and investors in the US. Pension funds, university endowments are uniquely safe investment funds because they do not rely on private investors and the fact that they have their own money, and they exist uniquely in the US and circle a lot of the US currency. This is not true about other countries, especially developing countries that they want to talk about, but also in Europe, because post this, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the incredible economic inequality in Europe has meant that a lot of money was concentrated in the hands of the most wealthy, which meant they didn't invest it in safe assets like pension funds, which is how we have much less of those currencies circulating in safe assets. Lastly, I want to talk about why it is that international crisis is especially bad on their side. They ask us, why does it matter if the US is able to defend itself? We have a diversity of currencies. Our claim is simple. Other countries might be diverse, but they're still reliant upon one another, which is what leads to crisis. Even if I am a country that exports oil and that imports oil and exports grain, and another one is a country that exports oil and imports grain, the problem is that there's a reliance between these countries, which is why even when there's just one oil crisis, like happened by OG's example, other countries collapse because they don't anymore have infusions of oil, which fucks up their economy also for the thing they're specialized in. This is how international crises like the 70s Asian economic crisis happen, and that is why we need a strong economy that is able to resist even crises that happen because of dependencies. This is where all of Ayal's analysis about the expertise of the central bank and the internal self-reliance of the US stands, as opposed to other European countries that do not have these same strengths. Bottom half.
If your only comparative is the idea that these countries that are more diverse are reliant on each other, contagion only spreads so far, right? If you have a basket of currencies, you're more capable of arresting the spread of contagion faster as a result of giving developing countries more flexibility.
No, that's an insane claim, Matt. Obviously, you have in trade agreements that supply you oil. If the oil supply is cut, your economy is shut. You can't just start transferring to other sources of oil that aren't Russia when Russia stops giving you oil. Otherwise, there would be no problem in Germany. There would be no problem for other countries that could switch to other oil sources in the middle of the crisis. The last thing I want to do is weigh this. Look, on their side, even if the US is sometimes unstable, you can use your own reserves in your own currency. That is an essential reversibility measure that only exists on our side. On their side, if the international world is in peril and the international currency is in peril, you don't have any higher valued, more stable currency like the US to use, which is how they don't have that similar reversibility measure. But secondly, and really crucially, the US learns from its mistakes. It ceases to, its mistakes don't recur because its central bank learns from the 2008 crisis. Other countries like China, etc., that don't have independent central banks don't adjust their problems, which is why international crises will probably happen more in the future than in the US. For all those reasons, opening opposition.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a very fine speech and all teams on top half for what's been a great debate so far, and I would like to invite the member of government to come and begin their case.
Can I be clearly heard?
Yep, you're all good.
Cool. OG has the right impact in this debate, but gets the causal mechanism for why SDRs are good wrong. We're going to explain, regardless of who you think wins the top half clash on stability, which has no link to the value of the US dollar on reserve markets, by the way, we would have gotten a better path to development on our side and reduced the degree to which the US can exploit poor countries and get a more stable global equilibrium. First, I want you to do framing as to why the top half clash is incoherent economically. OG says that the USD is unstable. They say this for two reasons. Firstly, the dollar can be unstable sometimes because of domestic US politics, or secondly, because the dollar fluctuating in value in response to crises in the US. They then say SDRs are better, which we agree with. However, the claim that the dollar is unstable for these reasons is incoherent. Why? The problem with this analysis is that the status quo, the vast majority of dollar reserves are held outside the US, precisely because it is the reserve currency by other central banks, by the treasuries market, the exchange of dollars on the open market, by private investors abroad. Therefore, a specific shock in the US, or a shock because of US politics, is extremely unlikely to impact dollar values, meaning their main mechanism of instability doesn't work. To illustrate this, it's very likely that a crisis in the US would cause people to buy more USD and stabilize its value in response to it, right? So the mechanisms they give are not persuasive, even if the impact is correct. There are other arguments, like countries not knowing their currency's value, are out of this debate at the point at which foreign exchange reserves exist on either side. Opening opposition, conversely, makes arguments that explain why actually the US will remain a key part of the financial system on our side, which we're fine with conceding. Why? Firstly, a lot of the observations they make about the centrality of the US dollar would simply not have emerged in the counterfactual. These countries would have transacted in SDRs historically on our side, meaning the majority of the illustrations that they give about why the US is so central to the financial system simply would not have emerged in the same manner as they develop. It's speculative, but I'll explain in my second extension why it likely would have been better. But thirdly, the arguments about the US being stable, a good place to trade, and so on, are not causally linked to the US dollar being the global reserve currency any more than OGs are, for the same reason I already gave in the framing. All these things can be true, and the value of the US dollar can still be relatively stable or relatively unstable. This debate is about sovereign debt and the way in which investors' response to that affects global reserve currencies, and whether we want the US to have more or less influence therein. Why does our world have substantially less volatility? And this is true regardless of whether you believe the US is stable or unstable, based on me delinking the impact, which we agree with from OG, from the premise of both top half teams. The premise of this argument is that the US dollar, being the world's reserve currency, is bad for emerging markets, which often have their currencies pegged to the dollar and their debt denominated or issued in US dollars. In our world, having a currency spread mitigates the impact of crises on the value of the treasuries markets, mitigating harms. What does this look like in precisely? When there is an economic crisis like 2008, the dot-com bubble, the petrol crisis in the 70s, this causes investors across the world to sell high risk and medium assets. The reason for this is simple. Economic shocks cause fluctuation in the value of unstable assets due to reduced demand for those assets and the perception those assets could become worthless quickly. When that happens, these investors and companies are likely to buy the most safe asset they can buy, which is the reserve currency on either side of the house. In ops world, it's the US dollar. This leads to a massive increase in the demand for the treasuries market for USD, which causes its value on international exchanges to grow rapidly. This is incredibly bad for developing countries, which now lack the capacity to pay down dollar-denominated debt as easily because the value of their own currency can't keep pace with the skyrocketing value of the dollar. But it's also bad for the market in general outside developing countries, which through contagion spreads to developing countries, because a flight to the USD devalues other currencies like the euro or the pound, which can cause economic harms. The comparative OG gets right. The SDR is a basket of currencies that cancels each other out, which is the OG mechanism. But the impact of this, that developing countries can now choose to pay down debt in any IMF SDR currency rather than only the US dollar, meaning they have flexibility to choose the currency within the SDR that suits them best to pay off, meaning they have more flexibility to pay down debt. Weighing this argument, giving developing countries more flexibility to pay down debt is the most important impact in this debate, because this is the pathway by which we gain solvency for the mechanisms opening opposition talks about. Secondarily, opening opposition gets the mechanism about the SDRs being good correct. But the problem is their analysis about stability is hinged on a premise that is economically incoherent, a premise that opening opposition buys into. We sidestep the top half clash by explaining the causal links to how values of these things go substantially, flipping the claim and thereby winning the debate. That's sufficient to take first, but secondly, I'm going to explain why we limit the extent of US influence broadly and we get better development on our side. This independently is debate winning, even if you want nothing I said so far. The premise of this argument is that the US has used its position as a global hegemon to dictate the terms of engagement of international development in the international arena. The way it's done so is held the threat of sanctions over the head, cutting them off international payment systems which use this dollar to transact, like SWIFT. They can threaten to freeze reserves held in the USD like they did to Russia, or implement sanctions on countries and individuals from using USD to exchange in business like they do in Bosnia. There are two terrible impacts of this. Firstly, it constrains the developing potential of developing states. They have to adhere on their side to specific economic economic models of development imposed by the US, like extremely unregulated capitalism, which ruined places like Congo or Somalia. But secondly, it gives the US much more leverage to bully other states because it lowers the barrier for the US to engage in threats. It takes away the need for political capital to go to war with a country, for example. Now you can just sanction them, right? It takes way more political capital on our side for the US to actually get enough capital to go to war with other countries or bully them more aggressively, but it's very low political capital to sanction them, which is easier on their side. This is bad principally because nations can't dictate their freedom properly, but secondly, the US exploits these countries far more and steals their resources. Before I explain the impact of this, I'll take opening opposition.
The link of foreign reserves was very clear in both top half teams. You use foreign reserves when your currency is weak in order to be able to re-stimulate growth and invest in the economy. Way
You are
against
empirically incorrect. Economics and the entire discipline of sovereign debt is not only laughing at you, but even if you don't believe that fact claim, which is inherently true, I give you structural reasons for why it is the case the vast majority of dollar reserves are held outside the US, meaning any market operation between the US will inherently have a small effect on that, but the market operations that happen outside the US are significantly greater. Already explained in the comparative. I trust the panel is smart enough to believe facts. Secondly, the US now has significantly less ability to do these bad things I talked about. In the absence of US interventionism, you get significantly more stability in these countries. They're now not constrained by neoliberal models of development, right? The reason this is really good is because the comparative is that when you limit US influence in this manner, you create an increased incentive for China to engage with international institutions. The China engaging with the IMF more frequently means A, the IMF is likely to dictate more preferential terms to developing countries because now developing countries has greater capacity to play kingmaker between the two that are participating in the same institution. But secondarily, countries are now able to pick and choose more easily the development system they prefer. This means more countries like Latin America, which would have had more freedom to pursue export-oriented industrialization on our side of the house, which they couldn't do because of US constraints on their development, can pursue different development policies on our side. Importantly, this wins regardless of whether you believe those development strategies would have been more or less successful. The freedom for these countries to choose their development model, absent the constraints, is principally justified. But we posit these countries know what's good for them, but they're constrained by a Bretton Woods-style development model that was incredibly prescriptive on their side. We free them from that on our side by giving them more flexibility, by reducing the leverage the US has to threaten them on the global scale. That's incredibly impactful. On weighing, why do I care more about this than the US pushing for human rights? Often human rights constraints are very harmful to developing countries because they withhold economic aid to countries like Uganda because they don't legalize gay marriage right now and people starve as a result, including gay people. That's really bad. But secondarily, they say diverse countries are relying on each other and contagion spreads. But contagion spreads far less on our side at the point of view of multiple different countries and currencies that you could disaggregate among. That is clearly winning independent of anything else. Finally, we get better development generally because when countries have currencies that are part of IMF SDRs, you spur more investment in different currencies. Now you get investment in the Deutsche Mark and other currencies that spreads across the globe more frequently, which reduces the extent of contagion. Paula can impact that further, but because I gave the clear economic incentives in the debate and I explained politically flipping opening opposition's argument, where we get better development for developing countries, I'm incredibly proud to win from CG. Believe facts, not feelings.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a very fine speech, and I would like to invite the member of opposition to come and begin their case.
Econ is plausibly the only debate area in which we can actually drop OO. Let's go into our case, which is responding on a clash to the CO case about how American interference in the economy is actually very bad for those countries. We are going to say that even if they are correct on that kind of analysis, we are going to flip them on where it happens more by showing you internally and externally why those countries have more of an incentive to concede to the IMF and actually to reduce their own autonomy over the way that they use their monetary policy. I think the impacts of this are already laid out in Matt's speech, but I want to add a little bit more to that. Number one, it's more important than crises because again, they are much more frequent. It's about the actual sectoral, development of the developing countries rather than the cyclical boom-bust cycles that are inherent to capitalism. Yes, there's going to be an Asian bust in the 1970s, but then there's going to be the Asian boom, which is meaning that, for example, the Asian tigers rise to prominence, in 2000s, because those things are cyclical. Capitalism operates on a sinusoidal wave, which is why stability is actually significantly less important than whether or not those countries have access to development that can help them actually overcome the systemic issues that are permanent to their economies. Let's go into why, on our side of the house, the IMF and the America has more control over how the economy of those countries develop. Let's do internal mechanisms first. Three internal mechanisms as for why those countries want to cede to the IMF significantly more. On the comparative, when it is seen that the IMF is an instrument of American oppression, you can do a lot of anti-colonial rhetoric about saying saying, hey, look, America is evil, America is dollarizing, America is trying to control us. On our side, that political narrative is significantly weaker, because at the point where the IMF basket of currencies is not just the dollar but also other currencies, you have significantly reduced the reach of that argument, reduced the persuasivity of this argument, which is why politicians are less likely to run campaigns against the IMF, which is the kind of thing that most African populists would be doing, which actually would be good for those countries, because again, the IMF influence is bad for those countries. Second, because again, those countries have an incentive to have their currency included in the IMF basket, and this is probably the strongest mechanism, so track it. Note, panel, that those countries benefit from having access to the SDR, having access to the reserve currency. As per Matt's analysis, you need to have access to that reserve in order to purchase things from outside of your economy, because those other countries are not willing to trade in, I don't know, Indian rupees, if they don't believe that Indian rupees hold any value to them in terms of the kind of goods that they can purchase for the Indian rupees, which means that those countries have a very, very strong incentive to actually keep their currency tied to the value of the SDR, to keep their currency tied to the value of the SDR the way that the IMF would like to see it happen. Why is that the case? Because again, they don't have an alternative, because there's no other strong currency that they can, just hold deals with other countries to buy or sell, which means that the IMF has far more control over how this currency develops, because those countries have a really strong incentive to cater to make sure that they are not going to be excluded from the future baskets, which means, and that has striking implications. Number one, that central bank policy making is significantly reduced in terms of how much they can manipulate the strength of the currency relative to other currencies. Why is that significant? Because central banks set price of currency based on the specific interest of those countries. Why is China devaluing currencies like crazy right now compared to the dollars by selling their currency for far less than it's actually worth on the market? Because they want to have a competitive advantage in export. Why is that good? For those countries in particular, because that is the only way in which they can make sure that the goods which are currently, not productive and not comparatively productive to the developed countries, they can devalue those goods and take momentary hit in order to create a base of like just investment coming in, because people are now interested in this as a destination, because they see it as a viable place that exports, because they see all of this export. But two, they're actually able to sell their goods for a competitive advantage on the market, because note, you are going to still be limited by the amount of value that your economy has in the world, in terms of the way that the IMF is actually assigning those values, which means that you are going to some degree be tied. But at the point where you are seen as a currency manipulator, the IMF can artificially exclude you from that, which is why China, for example, can't develop the way that it has, lifting 60% of its population out of poverty, which means that, India can't develop the way that it has and can't actually make massive strides in terms of how much they produce, in terms of how much they export. This is far more important than stability coming in from opening opposition, because again, stability is cyclical and a response to and can be overturned by the fact that we have future boom after a period of bust. This is something that is far more structural, because those countries at the point where they did not create an export advantage over other countries are not going to be able to develop to the same speed, to the same degree that those other countries were able to, and they're going to be outcompeted, because there is two things. Number one, first mover advantage. You're not going to be able to you're not going to be able to create those exports even if you have a competitive advantage if someone else has already signed trade deals with those other countries to compete, which means that timing is crucial, which means that if you have to go through the IMF in order to get your currency devalued, in order to have the IMF approve it without sacking you out of the SDR basket, you are going to significantly weaken that kind of time-sensitive advantage, putting you at a disadvantage to countries that are to the comparative world, in which you don't have to levy with the IMF to such a degree as you have to on the Gulf world. Second implication of this case, which is that those countries are going to be... Actually, before I go into that, I would like to hear opening government. Yes.
The IMF wouldn't just include high-value currencies, they would include currencies that are stable. Given that the US also raises and lowers its value of its currency, which screws over developing countries, how is your case unique?
Brother, you literally just said how this case is unique. You include the currencies which are stable, and you base the prominence of those currencies based on the amount of the percentage of the world economy that is held within those countries. Implication number one, that you worry about losing your status, because this is the only way in which you can get access to global trade, because you cannot get access to other currencies. You can only get access because your currency is pegged to all the other currencies. Then you need to keep the currency stable. You can't devalue it. This is significant. Even if you don't care about whether or not you can get enough dollars, whether or not you you want to get this much dollars for this much or this much for this much, even if you feel like this is going to be very beneficial for your economy, you can't do this both internally and externally, because again, the IMF is going to force you not to, because the IMF has a huge incentive in making sure that this system is stable, because they don't want to have crises that spread and ripple at the point where there is one instability in one country devaluing their currency, which means that the IMF necessarily will need to have stronger mechanisms within those countries to control them, and this is going to necessarily constrain the CB autonomy. Why is the CBs good on our side of the house in the developing countries anyway? For two reasons. Number one, because of the mechanisms that come from OG about why central banks in America are good, e.g. they are very well educated, very well researched, they can learn on their own mistakes. This is true symmetrically on both sides, because central banks are the central institution of a country. You probably can send people to international schools, which is why, if you notice, for example, the Ugandan central bank manager is actually someone who studied at Harvard and who got high grades from the economics school, which is why the mechanisms are symmetric. The CBs are going to be good on both sides of the house, but only on our side they have the autonomy to actually raise and lower the inflation, interest rate, etc. That is in regards to how those economies feel rather than how the global system feels. So proud to take a second from closing opposition.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a very fine speech, and I would like to invite the government whip to come and close government's side of the debate.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yep, loud and clear. Although you have just muted again, so I'm making sure that's intentional.
Sorry, I'm using MacBook first time in my life, and I have no idea how this works. Just give me a second. Okay. Okay. You can hear me?
Yep, perfectly.
Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's respond to the closing opposition. Firstly, Amelia says that developing world governments and leaders will engage in way worse and more corrupt forms of development. Firstly, Matt preempts this when he explains that even if theoretically some countries would adopt worse development models, we are perfectly fine with that, because what we believe is that countries have self-determination. It is incredibly wrong for the US to impose legacy of colonialism on them for 30 years just due to the fact that it's global reserve currency and all these sorts of things. But secondarily, Matt also explains why the one-size-fits-all development policies in the that the US prefers, like neoliberal deregulation, are usually really bad. For example, some countries might want to put tariffs on local goods to protect their domestic industries from being outcompeted by foreign firms, or like something which you can't do under the neoliberal US policies that aim to enrich the West at the expense of global South. So on our side of the house, we have increased flexibility and far better, and this is something that is far better, especially for vulnerable developing countries that, like, historically, because of this, were not allowed to like protect their domestic industries, and they would get like price dumped by like cheap US goods and all these kinds of things. Secondly, Amelia says that IMF can engage in labeling countries' currency manipulators. They have this backwards. This is what the US does currently because it has an extreme amount of leverage. The IMF has less leverage because it is not an army. It cannot invade EU, and check and balances from different countries participating, checks and balances exist from different countries participating, because notice, if you see Infoslide in 70s, this was a bundle of 15 different countries, which means that they can all checks and balance each other. IMF, for example, is like a bundle of many different countries with competing interests. Like China, for example, has huge stakes in IMF and all these sorts of things, and they can keep each other accountable. Thirdly, Amelia says that countries won't develop trade properly, and this is something that is bad. This is already preemptively flipped when Matt explains how countries are under less pressure by the US to sign bad trade deals and can therefore opt into better trade deals with fewer conditions. And this is something that can decrease the leverage that the US already has. Okay, I think this is dealing with closing opposition. Now I want to deal with the opening opposition, and I'm going to weigh us against the opening government. So the first thing that the opening opposition says is that, like, other countries, so when they're talking about stability, right, they're explaining that other countries are affected by crisis more and therefore inherently more unstable than the US. Panel, notice what examples they're giving. They're talking about like developing countries who have like one industry or one sector and all these sorts of things. This is kind of silly because it applies only to a certain type of countries. Notice that this has historically been a bundle of multiple different currencies from multiple different countries across the world that have completely different economies that are not contingent on each other. Chinese economy has not been affected by the oil crisis that has been happening in EU and all these sorts of things. Therefore, this argument does not stand. But secondly, as I said, crisis doesn't happen in all 15 countries at once. Like, for example, if Germany is doing well, that can offset and lower and cover for another country not doing so well, not doing so well, right? Thirdly, this also is, I can put a flip on this argument, because this is actually encouraging countries to help each other and to not screw each other over with unfavorable trade deals and predatory lending due to their economies being interconnected to the degree. Okay, next thing I also want to say is that they say, you know, there are like other countries are still reliant on each other and exogenous shock, and they give you examples of oil crisis. Oil crisis did not hit the whole world. As I say, it didn't hit Middle East. It didn't hit Middle East currencies. It didn't hit how you say, Asia and all these sorts of countries. It hit only EU. And very conveniently for us, this is a bundle of different currencies. Even right now, it is like currency from China, from Middle East, like all these different, I think I explained this enough already. But also, yeah. So yeah, I think that we can then leverage against this. And then I want to respond to Amitai's POI to Matt. He says, you only use reserves when your currency is doing bad. No, this is empirically not true. You have to pay off debt very often, all the time in US dollar, because lenders will only allow you to pay off in US dollar. You have to do trade deals in US dollar and all these sorts of things. So this is just empirically not true. This is why vast majority of US dollars are not held into the US country. They're held outside in like central banks and other like financial entities and all these kinds of things. Lastly, what they're talking about is that they're saying that like, how you say, US bonds have been, you know, very stable and valuable because US is a hegemon. Guys, the counterfactual is that our IMF currency, or the bundle of different currencies, however you want to call it, is going to change US in doing these sorts of things, which means that the centrality that opening opposition is talking about would have never happened on their side of the house. And I would actually want to flip this, because what global reliance on US dollar historically meant is that US was massively privileged through its financial system. That meant that people were always buying US bonds, that they were always able, that US was always able to borrow for cheaper, that US equity would always outperform other equities and all these sorts of things. This is bad, and it comes at the expense of other countries, because their finances have fled, because people wanted to buy US equity, and they wanted to go to US equity market and buy US bonds rather than spend money domestically. Counterfactual on our side of the house is that people would buy bonds from France, China, Germany, all these other countries, which would then strengthen their currency, increase their purchasing power, be better able to pay off their foreign debt, and generally have more money. On the weighing, this is massively important, because this is a bunch of countries that are benefiting, not only USA. POI from OO.
We don't need to prove all countries' currency collapse to prove a major delta on the currency. Both bottom half teams talk about things and reliance that has to do with a lot of economic activity.
Okay,
crisis is unique to reserves.
Okay, the problem is, given the empirical fact that vast majority of US dollar exists in other countries of the world, that then means that if you want to talk about exogenous shock, they affect US dollar symmetrically. Therefore, you have zero comparative on this point. Then you have zero comparative at this point. Lastly, I want to weigh with opening government. I think they did an excellent job, and I'm not thinking that we contradict them, because we agree that what happens within the US to some, like US policies and all these sorts of things, to some degrees has effect on the value of US dollar. However, where we extend is where opening government doesn't give you the whole picture. Empirically, the reason why historically US dollar was used as a world reserve currency is is because it was held outside of the US, which means that any impact that happens outside outside of the US can affect the domestic, can cancel the domestic shocks that may happen within the US, which is something that by the wider impact that happens outside. And therefore, I think that we are also not contingent on the stability of US dollars. Our impacts are much larger, and that's why CG wins.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a very fine speech, and I would like to invite the opposition whip to come and close the debate as a whole.
I'll take my POIs verbally, please. I'm going to do three things in this speech. Firstly, I'll weigh our extension as the most important contribution to the round. Secondly, I'll deal with CG. And lastly, I'll take out OG. Firstly, on our extension, we tell you something that's very simple. We tell you that countries are likely to want to be in this SDR basket. That a condition, as OG themselves recognize for being part of the SDR basket, is by having a stable currency. This makes devaluation incredibly difficult because devaluation destabilizes your currency in the short term and is likely to render you subject to exclusion from this basket on the part of the IMF, that it's likely to have an incentive to dictate what you do. Devaluation is incredibly important for developing countries such as Egypt, such as Tunisia, because the only way in which these countries have eked out their comparative advantage on the global stage in rice and garments respectively is through devaluing their currency, is through imposing these policies that wouldn't have been possible on their side to enable them to grow their become comparatively more developed than they would have been otherwise. What is the response we get to this case? We get this idea from a POI and both in response from closing that this happens anyway, that the US does currency manipulation, the US also devalues its currency, and that it's very hard for these countries to opt into good trade deals. The first thing I would note is that the US does this to a significantly lesser extent insofar as it's unlikely to want to be seen as hypocritical. But secondly, I think to a certain extent this is true. But know that these things can be mitigated over time. For example, there is a huge amount of pressure on the US to ensure that the conditions that it imposes on its loan
I've paused
and the extent to which it can designately decrease because of the fact that the IMF and China and the Asian Development Bank. But the way in which you are able to, the way in which this is particularly pernicious is the creation of implicit coercion on their side to all developing countries. And this isn't just the countries who end up appealing for loans, it's also all of the developing countries who want to be in this basket. And we tell you that it's likely that this is going to be the vast majority of developing countries because firstly, you're likely to benefit from international trade if you are part of the SDR basket. Secondly, you are more likely to benefit in a global financial crisis for the mechanisms we get as to why people tend to flock to this currency in the event of a financial crisis when they don't know to what other currency to turn. And thirdly, you are seen as a credible source of investment. These are all things that in the short term are very appealing, which precludes the alternative of devaluation, which in the short term incurs harms, meaning that politicians are unlikely in developing countries to take this alternative, even though it's often a prerequisite for development. How do you weigh this extension then? The first thing is to note is that this is all developing countries that we're talking about, not just the ones with the debt that OG and CG talk about. And we're also less likely to get these countries into a situation when they are taking out excessive amounts of debt. Because the reason why debt crises tend to happen is because you can't develop, you're stuck in a cycle of importing. We get that development that the neoliberal model for a couple of reasons. A, we can co-opt all of their weighing on developing countries better imports. It's far better to get your export industry up off the ground than it is a import industry. But B, also Chinese exploitation probably happens on either side. The reason why there was the Belt and Road Initiative wasn't necessarily linked to the currency. It was plugging the gaps in infrastructure, and that was something China could do because of its supply of labor and something of its supply in capital. The mechanisms we give you are solely due to the currency manipulation and solely due to those mechanisms. Fourthly, over OO. We think it's true that the US is comparatively more stable, but we don't know how that will play out in the future. Our case is absolute and it applies however long into the future that you want to talk about, because developing countries will always be there. And fifthly, development is a prerequisite for having stability in the first place. And that's because when you're able to develop and diversify and you're less dependent on one industry, which is often what leads to these currency shocks in the first place, such as the example of OPEC that they talk about. Before I go on to talk about closing, I will take that POI from OG.
Financial crises often destroy the economies of countries and hinder development for decades. If that is the case, why is it important to ensure that these systems are stable before ensuring that they can ensure development?
We think it's far more likely that they are going to be subject to the coercive pressure to not do that on their side, because their short-term incentive is to be a part of this SDR basket. Second thing to do then is deal with what CG tell you. So they claim that there's likely to be far less volatility with the currency because of the way in which investors flock to the safe assets when the US is the reserve currency. I have a couple of responses there. The first is that volatility is something that is far more likely to happen on their side. And I think even if you buy the analysis on the US dollar being unstable, which is the analysis that we get from opening government, having the SDR itself is very bad and creates this financial instability. And that's because of the mechanism that OG identifies to how the currencies that form part of this basket change over time, there is often speculation and uncertainty as to which currencies are going to be moving in and out of the basket. And this can lead to several countries around the world doing very shady things with their central banks. So, for example, you're going to get the bigger replication of things like the 2020 Swiss franc crisis, when people were putting upward pressure on the Swiss franc because they believed that it was strengthening, meaning that the central bank was pushed into harmful actions such as making large interventions in foreign exchange markets. When you have lots of other countries doing this, because no one knows in the next 5-year cycle that the Infoslide specifies which countries are going to be in the basket and to what extent they're going to be part of that basket, you are more likely to create currency crises. Note the strategic implications of this. It amplifies everything that OO tell you about why international crises are being bad, but it also proves why there's likely to be far more crises on their side. And I think this undermines the central point of having a reserve currency, insofar as you don't know what currencies to buy up reserves for, because now in a financial crisis, everyone flocks to the US dollar, and that is able to stabilize those financial crises. It's far less likely on their side because you have that uncertainty and you have the distrust of several countries. Let's finally deal with what OG tell you then. So OG, the things that they have left standing are things like developing countries are going to be able to pay off their debt far better and imports become more affordable. I think it's very difficult for developing countries to develop. And the reason why they are able to develop their own currencies in the first place is because they are able to develop currencies that they can peg to the US dollar. For example, the Hong Kong dollar was pegged to the US dollars in the 90s, and that helped its rise as one of the Asian tigers. A peg enables you to ensure that firstly, you do have monetary control over your policy, but you can simultaneously know that you are safe in the event OG that necessitated this basket in the first place just didn't able to cancel each other out and fluctuations being less likely to affect the market. I think on our side, we are able to influence the US, and that's because you know the US knows that most of its reserves are held in other countries, so it has an incentive to cater towards those other countries, and people know to scrutinize the interest rate rises in the central bank activities of the US specifically. It's important, and it makes affecting the stability of this country, of this currency, far more difficult for all other countries who have a vested interest in it. For all these reasons, I'd
like to thank that speaker for a very fine speech and all teams for what's been a great debate. If